I've never seen the point in historical fiction. I once thought about writing a novel along those lines, but I began to wonder what possible patience the public could have for a young man arrogant enough to believe he has anything to say about an epoch with which his only acquaintance is flipping listlessly through history books on train journeys. Now, before you react, I think it's only fair to point out that that quote comes from The Teleportation Accident by Ned Bowman, and I'm hoping that today's panellists are going to give us some answers to that question. And what a fantastic panel we have for you. We've got Jane Dixon-Smith with The Better of Two Men. It's a fantastically confident book. It takes us all the way back to Palmyra in the 3rd century AD. Our narrator is Zabdus, who's grown up in the household of Zenobia, who's Queen of the Sands. And she is, Jane, if correct me if I'm wrong, but she's sort of a Boudica type character, perhaps a little bit lesser known than that. Yeah. And it's a fantastic story of revenge, power struggle and political play. And to me it feels like a very modern story, which I think is the litmus test of a great historical novel. I really enjoyed that one. Then we have Orna Ross's The Secret Rose, Her Secret Rose, which is a fictional biography about two really fascinating characters in relatively recent history, 1890s, and it transports us to Dublin, to Paris, to London, and it tells the story of the poet Willie Yeats and the woman he was in love with, Maud Gonne, but she's a political player in her own right. And again, another fascinating read there, I really recommend. Then we have Radhika Swarup's Where the Rivers Part. And this takes us back to another relatively recent episode, the partition of India and Pakistan. And I think this really performs the service that historical fiction does so well. It's such a huge subject. Partition resulted in the displacement of the largest displacement in human history. And what Radhika does is she makes this really accessible by just showing it to us through the eyes of her main character, who is a Hindu girl who's grown up in absolute harmony with her Muslim neighbours. Her best friend is Muslim. She's been secretly in love with her best friend's brother, and then the whole thing falls apart. Her whole world falls apart. It's a wonderful, wonderful read. And last by no means least, we have Alison Morton's Aralia, which is part of her Roman novel series. It's actually the prequel to the other books she's got here today. It's set in the 1960s, it's familiar, but it's also very different. And this is because Alison writes alternative history. And I'm going to leave it to her to explain the concept of that to you for those who are less familiar. Look, she's got a lovely bookmark as well there. It's a thriller, really taut, tense thriller, full of intrigue again. And let's crack on with the questions then, shall we? So my first question to you, because they're very, very different books, and I think it's going to demonstrate the wealth and the breadth of what falls under the category of historical fiction. So my first question to the panellists is, what does historical fiction mean to you, and what rules do you set yourself when writing with it? And I've got another slightly controversial quote, which this time comes from Orna's book, My Secret Rose. It says, most people treat history, if they're aware of it at all, as their own personal backup file, rummaging through the centuries to pull out whatever interpretation of events they fancy. Now those are actually the words of your narrator, aren't they? Not your opinion yourself, but let's start with you and see how you define historical fiction.
Thanks, Jane. Hi, everyone. Okay, well, they're the words of Rosie, the character who tells the story of Willie Yeats and Maud Gonne, and she's a very down-to-earth, very sort of prosaic person, and so it's not quite how I see it, though I wouldn't entirely disagree with her. Value of historical fiction for me is very much what you pointed out when you were talking about Radhika's book, which is that we get events through the lens of one person, and that to me is far more truthful than purported facts that told through a purported objectivity in a history book. Though, of course, we need those history books in order to write our fiction. For, I think, every historical novelist, the process begins with research, and I think a lot of us have to stop ourselves researching. That it's so much easier to research than it is to actually write. And so for me, yeah, it's totally about telling what happened, but telling it slant, telling it through a viewpoint, through a voice, and through a particular set of experiences that then reveal the whole. So the more particular you get, strangely and paradoxically, the more universal the story becomes.
Do you want to carry on with that?
Yeah, of course. History so often is about conflict, and in any conflict there's my story, my truth, your truth, and somewhere in the middle is the real truth. And I think what a writer and a fiction writer is allowed to do is to step into the middle, to inhabit my skin, to inhabit your skin, and discover the truth, or discover some sort of truth that feels, that horrible word, authentic. That's what I think historical fiction is good at doing.
Yes, lovely.
Yeah.
What about you, Jane?
I tend to use it more as a backdrop and a skeleton for building a set of characters that they may or may not have lived in history, but they're my characters. They're like facets of me, and it's just a backdrop for giving them reactions and seeing how they live in that world and how they react to all the things that happened at that time.
Well, history is a very strange thing. I come at it as a historian and as a writer. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an example. Now, in English, we say history and stories. In most other European countries, the word is the same. Histoire, histoire. Storia, storia. German, Geschichte is Geschichte. So we have a very strong idea, certainly in Europe, that stories can be history. History can just be stories. As a Roman writer, if you like, how much credence can I give to somebody who's putting propaganda on behalf of their emperor, or who's telling the dirty secret history of that emperor's reign? And is it somewhere in between, as you were saying? And as to what individuals during those ancient times thought, I think they're people like us, so that's their story. So I'm very conflicted on what history is.
It's very interesting that it's history, and you know, feminists make a lot of that.
Yes,
his story, and it's very interesting that so often history is written by men and considered to be the truth, and historical fiction, not universally by any means, but is written by far more often by women and is considered to be something less than the truth.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the truth there, because my next question was going to be that as authors, do you think you're justified in introducing a few inaccuracies to your fiction so that you've got a sufficient number of twists and turns to keep the reader satisfied? I don't know. Jane, would you like to take that first?
Yes, I changed a few dates around from things that were published, but there's very little actually written about Zenobia and very little known about her, which is kind of why she appealed to me so much. And so I got to invent quite a lot, and there was a few dates and I just thought, well, they must have got that wrong, so I'll change it. Historia Augusta is not right, so I'll just swap that 2 years.
Well, a lot of it is inaccurate, Historia Augusta, so you're all right, you're perfectly safe.
Yeah, and a lot of the time, especially when you're talking like Roman history and stuff like that, it's written by the victors, so it's one-sided all the time, so it's not necessarily true anyway.
True.
It's very true. Very true. I mean, yeah, I would go with you, and it's only one person's slant on that particular story. I'm with you about changing things a little bit.
It's not a very accurate documentation all of the time, especially when you're looking as far back as that.
I think it depends on the book as well. My first novel were about the Irish Civil War, which is a great big lacuna of silence. It didn't happen in Ireland. You know, they skipped straight from 1916, the War of Independence, and then, 10 years are missed out because they'd rather not remember what happened. And so you had to make things up. But with this book, Her Secret Rose, because it is relatively recent, because the relatives, the descendants are still alive and well and very well-known people in Ireland, I felt a real obligation, and also because these people had documented their lives so unbelievably. I mean, there were letters and diaries and their own articles, their own books, their autobiographies, novels, everything. I was under this horrible thing of trying to fit the story into what is already extremely well documented, and it took me forever because, it's so hard to get, it's not even about wanting to change the facts, but a story must have a story rhythm, and it must, build to little payoffs and turning points, and, to actually make what really happened fit that was horribly hard. I'm never doing anything like this again.
We say never again every time, don't we? Then we do. What about you, Radhika?
So, like you, Orna, mine was relatively recent. The subject matter I'm covering took place in 1947 and in the years following 1947. So there was relatively little leeway for me to play around with the facts and with the geographies. I did change the location of the fictitious town everything's based in, so there has been some playing around with the facts. But otherwise, with a book like mine, you have to make it believable, because there are so many people around who have lived through that period, who know people who've lived through that period. You have to make it believable. So for me, there was little room.
So in more recent history, where there are still living people who, with some memory, then we've got less room for flexibility. I'm interested why each of you decided to bring your particular story from the past to the present day. I don't know who'd like to take that first. Alison.
Right, okay. I will explain a little bit about the back later, if you wish, about alternate history. Why Rome? And why did I bring it in? Well, I've been fascinated since I was 11 years old, and I walked on the first mosaic pavement. And I wanted to know who the people were, what they did, everything. So my father told me senators and all the rest of it, and traders and scoundrels and soldiers, that the Rome we get, courtesy of HBO. And I said, well, what did the women do? And he said, oh, they stayed indoors and looked after the children. Right, not good for a feminist, this. Yes, I love my child. And I said, well, suppose the women ran it. Shock horror. And that was behind it. It was a purposeful wish to take my love of Rome and it's not love, fascination by Rome, and give it a feminist twist. So it had to come into the 21st century, because with the best will in the world, you can't have a lot of feisty misses in Rome. Just would not work. Gross patriarchalist society, and I'm not being weird, it wouldn't happen. So that's why it's come up to the 21st century.
Fantastic. Jane, you've gone back furthest in time, all the panellists today.
Yeah, I went 3rd century Syria, and I bumped into Zenobia in a book by Antonia Fraser, Warrior Queens, and it was just the fact that she was so like Boudica that I couldn't understand why people hadn't heard more about her, why there weren't films, why there wasn't a lot more information out there, and that she'd been portrayed, because she led one of the most threatening revolts that the Roman Empire ever faced, and yet nobody's heard of her. And that's why I felt that I had a duty to bring her to the fore.
Yeah, I have to say I found her a really interesting character, really fascinating, so definitely. What about you, Radhika?
On my father's side of the family, we come from a partition family. So we made my grandparents made the journey from what is now Pakistan into Delhi. But growing up, I never understood what that meant for us. I didn't understand the sacrifices my family had to make. I grew up in a comfortable home. We never wanted for anything. And when, the exodus in Syria and other places in the recent past started taking place, was when I started wondering what the partition actually meant for us. No one ever spoke about any of that kind of stuff, any of the sacrifices not we, but my grandmother's generation must have made. Their children are extremely driven. All have done extremely successfully. And that really is, I'm sure, because of the sacrifices my grandparents' generation must have had to make. And also, what comes out from my grandparents' generation is this immense amount of fondness for their lives in Pakistan, what was then unified India. And I just wanted to write a novel that brought out life in unified India, and also brought out how terrifying the schism was, and how quickly it unraveled, and how unstoppable it was. So I wanted to just bring
you really
that
get
out.
a sense of that. This very neighbours living alongside each other, really even those people who are politically involved, not realising the implications of it, and everything falling apart. Yes.
There's a lot of idealism at the start, isn't
Yes.
there?
Yes. What about you, Orna?
Well, for me, I'm a super fan of Yeats, and he's drummed into every Irish school kid, but I fell ridiculously in love with the poetry at the age of 12 or so, and he's done this amazing. He was a great PR man. If he was alive now, he definitely would be an indie author, and he'd be he'd be doing very well. He was really good at seeding his work and putting it out there and reaching his readers and so on, at a time where it was much more difficult. And he mythologized lots of things. He lived and worked here in London for most of his life, but he mythologized his love for Maud Gonne completely. He was the last romantic, was how he defined himself, and he was her courtly lover, and she was the love of his life, 6 foot tall, incredibly beautiful, and when he met her, he fell completely in love with her, and the love was unrequited, and no matter how often he proposed to her, she refused him, and he made great poetry from that, and that was his story. And then I was researching, and I found something that told me that was not true at all. And if you actually looked at it from Maud Gonne's perspective and read some of the things she said and some of the other things that he said, you realise that actually that couldn't be true. And so it was unpicking that and looking at it from the woman's side as well that gave me the story that I felt really needed to be told, because because he said it, everybody accepted it, but it made much less of him in a funny way, but it really made much less of her. And it was all, so much was being covered up. Their story is fascinating in terms of just what went on in their lives, and they were hugely interested in spiritualism, and he was a magician. He wanted to be Harry Potter, basically, and he was as interested in magic as he was in literature. He saw the two as being very closely connected, and she was an amazing woman in her own right, and the picture he put out of her was very one-dimensional, and she's really a very multifaceted character. And then when he was 50, he proposed marriage to her daughter, and I wanted to find out how that happened. So this book is actually the first book of a trilogy. The next one is about his relationship with the daughter 20 years later, and the final one then is actually about the relationship between the mother and daughter.
Wow. Actually, that leads me on to one of the other questions I have, which you've probably answered there, Orna, but I was going to ask any of you if any of you discovered something genuinely surprising in your research that changed the trajectory of the novel that you were writing.
I don't know. I thought about this question, and I don't think I did. To be honest, I think I found what I thought I would.
Yes.
In research. Yeah.
You weren't disappointed by Zenobia?
I wasn't disappointed. No, I think by the time I was hooked, I knew what I needed to know, and then after that, and then I kind of invented my own twists and things that surprised me afterwards. But I can't tell you what they are because it would spoil it.
I've had some surprises, not in the writing of it, but since it's come out. So the protagonist, Asha, she falls in love in the 1940s with a Muslim boy. And I thought this was kind of stretching the realms of belief a bit, because this was a very conservative country. There were very, very firmly drawn boundaries between people of different faiths. But I thought, okay, fine, it's a writer's privilege. You can write and it'll make it a beautiful, poignant story. after having written it, so many people have come forward to me, people who are now in their 90s, 80s, from that region, saying, yes, we did love someone from the other religion. Sometimes it prospered, the love prospered, sometimes it didn't. But, you know, those sort of boundaries were crossed. So that was surprising, but it was a nice surprise.
So it's sort of realised that what you had written was more relevant and perhaps more
Yes,
true than you had thought at the time. You thought you were stretching them.
Yes, yeah.
Well, I revisited the late 1960s, and like most people who sort of lived through them, what was I, 16, 17, I thought, oh yeah, I know that, don't have to do much research. And I was quite struck by how much I didn't know. And I think that it was a general thing rather than one particular thing, because you think, oh, I know my life, I've lived it. You know, I've lived through this and this. You don't know anything. And it was quite scary how much reading I had to do back to get the flavour of the late 60s, early 70s. That was quite a shock. So never ever trust your memory, ever.
Excellent. Now, I want to come on before I forget that each of you has been asked to bring today an object that tells us something about your approach to writing. So could you please reveal your objects?
Who do you want to go first?
That's all of you. I'm going to decide. I'm going to see who looks the most intriguing.
I have to get mine.
Mine's dead boring.
Dead boring. Piece of paper. It's a folded piece of paper, though.
No,
we
that's
have no idea what's on
That's
it.
completely insignificant. That was just so fit in my pocket.
Oh. And you've brought. I know you couldn't. You said you couldn't
bring
smuggle
this.
yours through customs.
I've flown in from France for this, and I could not bring that through the customs. You can
Okay.
understand why. This is a Pompeii Gladius, which was a standard service issue to most Roman foot soldiers. It's only called Pompeii Gladius because they found 4 of them, but it's a very plain one, and it went on for 4 centuries, this pattern, so you can imagine they were churning them out by the tongueful. Now, this is not one, but this is an idea. It's a piece of beading, sorry. There's the handle, so this is the size. Now, this is all very nice and interesting research-wise, and we all know they jabbed and they cut, but it actually affects my writing, because I aspire to write in a very succinct way, and I'm completely pitiless about my approach to my first draft. And this is perfect if I visualise that, or that is what I do to my writing.
Take a sword to it. Jane, what about you?
I have actually brought a book, and this is my absolute Bible for writing about Zenobia, because Richard Stoneman, who wrote it, is one of few authors who've written a book dedicated to it. She's normally a small passage in somebody else's book, and since I bought this 10 years ago and started on my journey of writing about Zenobia, there have been a few others written, but apparently this is still the best one. But it's also the only book that I have ever defaced. And it is really, it's highlighted. This is awful.
Shocking.
I feel really bad. And I've written on the maps. And I've had to buy a second copy because I felt so bad about it.
I deface every book I read.
I do too.
I know.
I even
Margin notes.
Well, I
can't
Can't do that. So, but I didn't want to get the whole thing photocopied, so I just thought I had to buy 2 and write on 1.
Fantastic.
So this is a method I used until the summer came along. So I wake up early in the morning before my kids are up, and that's when I write. And what I do is I don't take a watch in with me, and I don't take my phone in with me because I don't want any sort of distraction. So what I do is I write until the light starts falling on this bit of the bracelet, and then I know it starts getting light and I need to get up and I need to get on with my mothering. And then I come back when it's nice and light and quiet and the kids are out, and then I write till it starts growing dark again. Because I can see the change in the colour here.
That must vary different times of the year.
That system broke down in the summer and really, really broke down over the heat wave of the past couple of days. So I don't know what I'm going to do now.
Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely. What about you, Orna? What is on your piece of paper?
Don't you despise this very important index card?
Oh, it's an index card. I'm not just
So it's an index card, and the reason it's significant for me was because I spent a long time trying to write fiction, and it wasn't until somebody, and I wish I could remember so I could credit them, introduced me to the system of not beginning to write the novel until, well, I write everything on hand, and then I talk it into the computer or type it. So writing by hand is very important to me. I free write and write in notebooks. And when trying to put a book together, I've used all sorts of tried to use all sorts of online systems, but I keep coming back to this, which is that you don't start writing the book until you have it on index cards and fully kind of know what's at least 3/4 of what's going to happen, but not just what's going to happen. One sentence on the front to say, this is what this scene is about, and the important thing on the back, what the function it serves in the story. So whether it's, you know, a turning point, at what point it comes in the story. So at the same time you're thinking about the content of the story and its function, and that basically made me a novelist.
Sounds incredibly disciplined.
Yeah, you're not kidding.
I won't tell you how I go about it. So I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with the issue of blending real-life historical characters with fictional characters? I know this won't apply to all of you. I'm told that one of the advantages of writing, of including fictional characters in a historical novel, is that you can bump them off without altering the course of history. But do they serve another purpose? Orna, can I come to you? Because I know that you've done this with Her Secret Rose.
Yeah, actually Rosie, who's an invented character but based on a real person also. She's based on her purpose in the book, is in the story, is not actually quite clear yet at the end of book 1. But she was really, really key to the novel, because until I got her voice, I was completely intimidated. So I tried to tell this story in lots of different ways, but because it's W.B. Yeats, for God's sake, I just felt it was so cheeky. And so, you know, at times, you know, you have about 65 different personalities when you're writing a book, and the one that was intimidated by W.B. Yeats was kind of leading for ages and ages until I got Rosie's voice. And it's based on the letters of a woman who was imprisoned with Maud Gonne for her revolutionary activities. And her irreverent sort of and very thoughtful, she's an uneducated woman with a very clear voice, you know, self-educated, I should say, and not formally educated, but highly self-educated. And the way she spoke allowed me to say what I liked about them. And so she was key for that reason.
So she gave you license to...
Her voice
Yes.
allowed me to say whatever I wanted to say.
Yes. Yes. Radhika, I don't know if you have any historical characters in your book, or if they're all fictional.
They are there in passing, but yes, the main protagonists are all invented. And I think they are so key, because it allows you, and it allowed me to paint, you know, these two events, Indian independence and the partition, such big key events in India and Pakistan's history from an intimate perspective. There's no other way to take that canvas and reduce it into a person's life.
Yes.
The only way to do it is to introduce invented characters.
Yes.
My narrator, Zabdas, was fictional, and then I realised after the first draft of the first book that he could actually be a later character that actually existed. So I changed his name to Zabdas, tweaked a few bits, and then carried on from there. So he's kind of worming his way in to be a major character. He's actually meant to be Zenobia's half-brother in the books, and that was never the case. He was never Zenobia's half-brother, as far as we know, but he did actually exist. And then I invented another character, a girl, and she goes on to be the daughter of a great general. And you know she's the daughter of a general, but it's kind of quite catalytic for later on, and it becomes quite a big story later on in the series.
Setting us up for the next one in the series. What about you, Alison?
Mine are all made up.
All made up. All made up.
I can tell you how I made it up, but yeah.
No, that's fine. One of the interesting things about writing historical fiction is that if your reader knows the era, then they approach the novel with the benefit of hindsight. And I'm just wondering how you've used that to your advantage when actually writing the novels. You're nodding, Radhika.
Yeah, and I'm the third generation of people to address the partition, the people who experienced the partitions in the 1940s and 1950s immediately wrote with great poignancy, great immediacy, and they probably had access to material that I will never have. You know, a lot of my historical research comes from family accounts, and you know, those are from family members who are approaching their 90s now. So I don't know how, you know, what extent they remember, what vividness they remember with. And also through archives, through third-party accounts. So, you know, my recall will by definition be more limited than them. But what I have is I have evidence of what's happened afterwards. You know whether partition was justified or not, what trajectory different people took, what paths different countries and people and races took. So I have that access as well. So while I will never have the immediacy that the people who lived through partition have, I have, like you said, the benefit of hindsight, and I have a different kind of perspective to bring.
Yes.
And not a lot of people know about Zenobia, so I tend to find that people kind of pick up the books and then they have a quick look online to see if she was real, because not a lot of people believe that she was. And then like, I didn't realise that she was actually a real person. I'm like, oh yeah, and that she actually did all of those things. I'm like, yes, she did. So yeah.
Oh. So creating an interest in that, and perhaps people will go back and
a
look
lot of
into
people
it
just think
themselves.
that she's made up, that she doesn't really exist. But I think it builds an interest, and then they usually want to go out and find a bit more about her.
Definitely.
Then they usually skip ahead.
Yeah, I think people discover a lot of history that way. You think, oh, that's quite, and I enjoy that story. Oh, I think I'll go and look her up. In my day, it was Encyclopedia Britannica, but you'd go and look on Google now. And it does, it can sometimes spark interest.
Yeah, I found a lot of other characters that have interested me.
Yeah.
But you kind of get carried off, don't you? And
Yes,
then you go down a different path. You don't need to know that. And that's a few hours gone.
I mean, mine is, I'll perhaps bring a little bit of context in. Mine's alternate history, which means that I've brought a Roman society up to the 21st century. And I try to keep it very Roman in culture and values, and that's their mindset and that's the way they live. But I have had somebody come back to me and say, well, I knew it wasn't Rome in the Roman times, but it's actually made me go back and re-look at Rome.
Yeah.
One has gone back to study history, and one has gone on to study Latin. Yes.
Fabulous.
Amazing.
So, yeah, that people can look and they say, oh, right, yes, I see. And it's the same spark.
Yeah.
So somebody who, and I've had people who are die-hard, what we call them the bash and clash boys of the Roman fiction world, mentioning no names. And people, well, that's what there's two lots of Roman writers, those who are the bash and crash boys and those who are the girls at home. I'm not going to say anymore.
Toga and yoga.
Yeah, I mean, we're a bit Roman in our attitude, you see. And the bash and crash boys will get people going to look up on Wikipedia what happened at the Battle of Cannae and who was Hannibal and did he really bring his elephants across the Alps and all that stuff. But people have said the Roman Nova books have given a different perspective on what did women actually do in ancient Rome. So in a way, although they're thrillers and they're a bit of a twist on history, they have increased the interest in history, so as a result.
Yes, I mean, I must admit, Orna, reading Her Secret Rose, I didn't actually know too much about the life of Willie Yeats before, and I have actually looked into it since. So
I think that's very gratifying for you know, when you have that interest. If you're that interested, you do want other people to share that interest. But I didn't. I wish I had thought about your question before I wrote these books, because writing about somebody who is as loved and revered as W.B. Yeats is actually dangerous. It's the only way I can describe it. I have had hate mail. I stepped into a nest of academics at the Sligo summer school, where people were completely outraged. They own Yeats, you know, the society and the academics in particular are very, very, you know, they don't like historical novelists at all, I'll put it that way, and they definitely didn't like my take on things, and it was really, really heated, so I probably should have thought a bit more about that before I started.
I don't know, you shouldn't be stopped.
No,
just because you're doing something a little
No,
controversial.
no, it wouldn't stop me
No.
at all, but I would have gone in much more prepared. I didn't expect it. I was actually
Right.
quite shocked.
Well, it's a bit like
Yeah.
Making Jane Austen into a party girl.
Yeah.
The Janeites would, apologies to the two Janes, but the Janeites would really have an argument. If you step too far off those boundaries.
Well, you see, I didn't step at all. Every word actually in their mouths is taken from a letter, a poem. Everything is completely documented. It is as accurate. I think it's actually more accurate than a lot of the academic writing. So I didn't, but it's more to do with that you're not supposed to go there
The
in that
perception.
way. Yeah, it's actually what it is it's between the genre, the two genres really.
You're kind of
and
part
one
of the
feeling.
mixed.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a good
Exactly.
It sounds as if you have an excellent defence there. I was criticised for a historical novel I wrote for supposedly letting my main character leave her son without too many misgivings. And I was told that part of the difficulty was the different mindset, whereas today we expect a mother to put her child before partners, husbands, etc. I disagreed. I didn't really want to make the changes that I was asked to make, but I'm just wondering how you perceive the temptation to impose conventional values on historical figures when you're writing historical fiction.
I think you've got one thing if you're writing a pure historical novel is to read the letters and diaries of people, not the historical account, because this is what people actually did.
Yes.
And as you say, sometimes you find it's not so. So I would, if I was doing that, I would always go to a source, if I could find one, about people and their lives. Obviously keeping in mind why are they keeping this journal at a time when people weren't mostly literate. So you've got to think a little bit about the old cui bono thing. But I would go to that. Even if she says, oh, today we got in 7 hogsheads of wheat or what have you, you know, whatever. That's much more interesting than somebody talking about the political economy of the late 18th century.
Yes.
So I think that's where you've got to go to get attitudes.
Yes, well
Yeah.
that was all your source material, of course, Orna, letters and diaries and...
A lot of private writings which have
Yes.
only recently become public, and a lot of writing that came out of copyright. It's just 70 years gone, so I was able to use it. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. You had a lot of verbal histories passed down.
Yes. Yeah, and that helped. But I did struggle when it came to the writing, in the sense that my protagonist is, for her generation, an extremely feisty woman. She finds her lover, she finds her husband, she chooses for herself, but she still has constraints placed on her just by her generation, by societal conventions of her time. So she has to be courted. She has to be proposed to. In fact, she doesn't have to be proposed to. Her father has to be approached by her suitor. So those sort of things, I knew those conventions would have to be followed in the novel, but you know, I struggled with them. I struggled with them because those things would not happen today. But I had to place it in the period in which the book was set. So I did struggle with them, but I
But it's
followed
very
convention in the
authentic as a result.
Yes.
It's
I hope so. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, fortunately, I mean, obviously, writing like Roman history, I mean, you kind of
Yeah.
turned it on its head for the female point of view, but I had the advantage of Zenobia doing things that we would want women to do today. You know, she was already married at 14, which was probably the only bit I had a few readers did come back to me and say, well, she couldn't have been married at 14, it would be too young. And I'm like, well, no, it wasn't actually for that time. And it's documented that she was. But she wasn't, you know, a stay-at-home wife. She rode into battle. She drank with the men. She did all of those things that kind of appeals to readers these days. And feels quite modern, you know.
Yes,
So,
no,
so
I
I didn't have
definitely.
that problem of trying to pull it into the modern. It already kind of felt modern anyway.
Absolutely. That's I
Yeah.
think a lot of people would identify
And I
with
didn't
her.
drag it there. It was
It
she
was
was
there.
doing it, yeah.
That
So-
was it.
Which
yes.
begs the question, were there more women like her?
Oh, I do wonder. Of course.
Not quite so prominent, but on a lesser scale.
Yeah.
But when I went back to the writings of the women in Ireland again, but here too, in the 1910s and 1920s, you know, pre-suffrage and pre all the revolutions that happened in the you know, that broke up the empire. When I read those women's letters, and this I'm going back now to in my 30s for an earlier book and other work that I was doing, because I too worked as a historian for a while. I felt like I was meeting myself and my friends on the page, and the documents and books and letters that they wrote, it was so moving. I actually sort of broke down one day in the library, because I realised that they had written and done exactly the kinds of work that we were doing in the 1970s and 80s, and then it had gone onto a shelf and nobody had looked at it for 50 years. It was as if they had never done their work, and our generation had to come along as if they never existed, as if their work had not been done. They were completely and utterly written out of the record. The feminists of our time went back and reclaimed their work and put it out there, and we hear much more, you know, and even now you get popular movies about suffragism and so on. But it's something that happens, we assume, and particularly with the great Victorian thing between us and the rest of the past, we have this idea that women's advancement is kind of a step up, and, you know, that leads to today this supposedly, you know, equal setup that we're supposed to have now. But actually, if you look back, you see it's much more like that, that it rises but it's suppressed, it comes and it's put back again. And I'm hoping that digital, actually Google and all, you know, what we have here in terms of communication will put an end to that, where you get this breach. It happens too in social history, you know, class history. The same fight has to be fought again, the same education has to be handed on again to young people. And, you know, it would be great if we can keep our history, because I think it's really important. The winners know how important history is. They always know to take it and to write it and to claim it. Yeats knew. He knew what he wanted to say and he put it out there, but you know, we don't always have the power to do that. So.
Can I say something a little bit about conventions?
Please, yes.
It was something I purposefully flaunted, or flouted is the word I'm really looking for, by putting women in men's roles and men in other roles, if you like. And then you still have to keep to a convention, because there are certain ways of, as with Zenobia, there was some things she just couldn't do, and some things she could do and she didn't want to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think you've got to keep within the convention of your story,
Yes.
which is another restraint in a way. So just a little side comment.
A rule that you set yourself. I just wanted to ask about the language in a novel, because I think sometimes if you use the language of the day, actually it's not the right feel for the book. So how do you strike a balance there?
That's a difficult one.
I tried to write quite properly.
Properly.
in my books. So I took out all like the contractions and stuff like that. So I only have certain characters that will use them, and just I try to not to use modern words, and they do speak in a certain. They all kind of speak in a certain way. I found my own little kind of language, and for a while I was watching. I don't know if anyone's seen it, Spartacus, the series on television, which they invented their very own unique way for the characters to talk, and it takes a little while to get used to. But I found myself sliding into it when I started writing after I'd watched episodes and had to try and pull myself back out.
Oh.
But that wasn't a really Roman way of talking or anything like that. But it was, they had invented their own way. So I think that's quite a good way of doing it.
It's a sort of a sub-language, isn't it? The Roman way of speaking is like British public school boys.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds funny, but if you look at films, there is a certain what's the word, convention
Yeah.
in the way, this is the way they
Yeah.
speak, and they use a certain register of words
Yeah.
and a certain sentence construction.
Yeah.
You know they're Romans because they speak like that.
Yeah.
Alison, you sort of alter the language where you take a saying in use now, but you'll have
Yeah.
you change it to the religion of the time, the
Yeah.
multi-gods instead of the
Yeah, I mean,
monotheism.
people, when they swear, they use Roman gods, so that's,
Yes.
everybody
Yeah.
knows then that we're in a Roman type thing. And we have little things like when somebody says, oh, I wouldn't be in your shoes when the other person finds out. I wouldn't be in your sandals, because obviously Romans tend to wear sandals. And we don't have chocolate digestives in the police squadron, we have honey cake. Romans were big on honey, so that's the type, but
Yeah,
that's more
sort of-
local colour.
Right.
But I'm with you on the language, and
Yeah.
my people are, especially the first set of 3 books, she's a young American
Yeah.
who is attached, doesn't know she has a Roman-Novan heritage. So that was a lot of study of going back and finding a couple of young Americans on the exchange programme at the University of Kent, and I would go over it every week with my script and get it right. It is distinctly a different language.
Fantastic.
And so you have to, as a linguist, you have to do I'm keen on doing the language research properly,
Yes.
because we are our language. You can tell whose everybody's personal history is by listening to how they talk.
Yes.
It's shocking, quite frightening. Do continue talking to me, because I'm listening to your history.
Well, you were talking about finding the right voice to tell
Yeah, I mean, I think
the story.
your question is just completely key. I think until you find the language, which includes how the narrator, if there is one, speaks, if there's one besides the authorial narrator, but finding the language is finding the book in a way. Until you have that, it's not there. Then they're so interconnected, you can't pull them apart. I think that's true of everything, science fiction or romance or any genre. It's
Very
for
true.
me, it's certainly true of historical, and the fact that it isn't pure fiction, that but it is fictional in a way. The language you use is not the language they used then. We wouldn't be able to recreate it even if we knew how. We didn't have tape recorders, and even if we did, I bet you'd change it anyway. You'd have to make it work. So it isn't of the time, but it needs to feel enough that it is for people to sink into something that's identifiably different to what they're hearing around them.
I think you're looking at authenticity rather than accuracy.
Yes.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, a different level of truth.
But like you, Orna, I struggled to find my voice. I knew for about a year that I was going to write a novel about the partition. The story, well, the setting was there, but Asha, my protagonist, her voice did not come to me, did not speak to me. So I had to, let the whole setting percolate in my mind for about a year. And it took a year before she walked into my head. And then I knew that then from there to trot out the first draft, which was flawed, very, very flawed, but the first draft took 2 months from her walking into my head. And once you have that authentic voice or that credible voice, then you know what you're going to write. Then the story pretty much writes
Yes.
itself.
You're off.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
mentioned
Great
the
moment.
setting there. Sorry,
Sorry,
Orna.
no, sorry.
No, you mentioned the setting, and you might be writing about a geographical area that you know very well, but because you're writing about the past, you've had to move the boundaries, or you might have actually superimposed some fictional boundaries over an area that's already there, or you may be writing about an area you know less well, perhaps in Jane's case. I'm just wondering how each of you keep track of your fictional canvas from a geographical point of view. And Radhika, I'd like to come to you, because your book is all about boundaries that have changed, of
Absolutely.
course.
In fact, the after picture of the boundary is what is said for me. So as a third generation partition migrant, I know the after picture. I know the boundary between India and Pakistan. So it was very important for the story for me to uncover the pre-partition boundary between Indian Punjab and Pakistani Punjab. So that took a bit of excavation. I had to talk again to family members, do a lot of research to find out what was where. My little town, fictional little town, moved a bit from where my grandparents had grown up. So it's nearer a river. It's a different location. So I have played with physical boundaries as well a bit.
Yes.
But yes, you know, things have changed. Boundaries between states, between countries have changed, and it takes a lot of imagination and it takes a lot of research to uncover the older boundaries and the way people lived in the past.
Jane, you've got your book with your
My book
maps in
with
it and
maps.
your highlighted pens.
Yeah, it's all the name changes that
Yes.
prove awkward. But then I didn't need to know the current boundaries at all, so I just went back and looked at the old boundaries and went from there. So it wasn't too
Because a
bad.
lot of Jane's book takes you on massive epic journeys across the desert landscape, and
my
that
worst
felt
part-
very real.
My worst part was how long it would take them to get from one place to another. So it was like, right, so how many miles can a camel go in a day?
Google.
And then times it by
Oh,
and get a rough estimation.
There's a very good tool done by Stanford University, and it's called Travelling in Roman
I
Times.
have come across that
And
since.
Orbis, and you can
Too
put
late.
in horses, carts, imperial courier, ship,
Yeah.
and it tells you,
Oh,
and it's
fantastic.
absolutely fantastic.
Yeah,
So-
everything's numerous days, weeks or months.
Yeah,
Yeah.
quite funny. Funny. So, I can give you two things for mine. I basically pinched Slovenia for Romanova because it has mountains and it has valleys and it has rivers and it's in Central Europe, wherever that is. So very Ruritanian, so I did that. But I had a real conundrum, and I really had to sweat this one out. I was asked to join a collaborative venture called 1066 Upside Down, and they wanted a Romanovan story set just before the Norman Conquest. Could we have changed the Norman Conquest? And a Romanovan councillor goes to try and talk to Duke William, say, look, don't do this is a bad idea, we all trade with Saxon England, let's not do this. Now I had to imagine what northern France looked like 6 centuries after the Roman withdrawal. So she thinks of Rouen as Rotomagus. The river Seine is the Sequana. Now trying to get that, have to actually explain to the reader, the Romanovan's going to call it the Sequana River. She's not going to say the Seine, because she doesn't call it that. That's not her reality. So having to imagine what Boulogne, which was the headquarters of the Classis Britannicus, the big fleet in the area, it was a huge, it was a massive port. We've all seen Ostia and the port in Rome. It was huge. Now it's a one-horse little thing with a silted up creek. So she's looking at it from that point of view. And the Seine Valley does not have built up. It has a few peasants' huts, woods, fields. So you've got to then project yourself back into what the 11th century would look like. And that sort of setting is very, very hard. And you can't do it on Google.
So do you have a map on the wall?
Sort of.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, we're going over, aren't we?
I had a horrible feeling we would, because I can hear that we're all during the Zumba class upstairs. So if you've got your training shoes on, I just wanted to thank the panel. And do please go and look at their books, because I had such a fantastic time preparing for today's session. But whether you agree that the past is a foreign country, or whether you believe that the past and future are actually very close neighbours, I hope that today's discussion has just given you some idea of the breadth and the variety of books that fall under the historical fiction banner. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.